It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, Chapter 36. The ban on information at the Trianon camp had been raised. Mrs. Candy had come calling a Doremus complete with coconut layer cake, and he had heard of Mary's death, the departure of Emma and Sissy, the end of Windrip and Saracen. And none of it seemed in the least real, not half so real, and except for the fact that he would never see Mary again, not half so important as the increasing number of lice and rats in their cell. During the ban, they had celebrated Christmas by laughing, not very cheerfully, at the Christmas tree Carl Pascal had contrived out of spruce bough and tinfoil from cigarette packages. They had hummed Stille Nacht softly in the darkness, and Doremus had thought of all their comrades in political prisons in America, Europe, Japan, India. But Carl apparently thought of comrades only if they were saved, baptized communists. And forced together as they were in a cell, the growing bitterness and orthodox piety of Carl became one of Doremus's most hateful woes. A tragedy to be blamed upon the corpos or upon the principle of dictatorship in general, as savagely as the deaths of Mary and Dan Wilgus and Henry Veeder. Under persecution, Carl lost no ounce of his courage and his ingenuity in bamboozling the guards, but day by day he did steadily lose all his humor, his patience, his tolerance, his easy companionship, and everything else that made life endurable to men packed in a cell. The communism that he had always been in his King Charles head, sometimes amusing, became a religious bigotry as hateful to Doremus as the old bigotries of the Inquisition or the fundamentalist Protestants, that attitude of slaughtering to save men's souls from which that Jessup family had escaped during these last 3 generations. It was impossible to get away from Carl's increasing zeal. He chattered on at night for an hour after all the other 5 had growled, "Oh, shut up, I want to sleep. You'll be making a corpo out of me." Sometimes, in his proselytizing, he conquered. When his cellmates had long enough cursed the camp guards, Carl would rebuke them. "You're a lot too simple when you explain everything by saying that the corpos, especially the MMs, are all friends. Plenty of them are, but even the worst of them, even the professional gunmen at the ranks, don't get as much satisfaction out of punishing us heretics as the honest, dumb corpos who've been misled by their leaders mouthing about freedom, order, security, discipline, strength. All those swell words that even before Windrip came in, the speculators started using to protect their profits. Especially how they used the word liberty. Liberty to steal the ditties off babes. I tell you, an honest man gets sick when he hears the word liberty today after what the Republicans did to it. And I tell you that a lot of the guards right here at Trianon are just as unfortunate as we are. A lot of them are just poor devils that couldn't get decent work. Back in the golden age of Franklin Roosevelt, bookkeepers that had to dig ditches, auto agents that couldn't sell cars and went sour, ex-Louis, in the Great War that came back to find their jobs pinched off of them. And that followed Windrip quite honestly because they thought, the saps, that when he said security, he meant security. They'll learn. And having admirably discoursed for another hour on the perils of self-righteousness among the corpsos, Comrade Pascal would change the subject and discourse upon the glory of self-righteousness among the communists, particularly upon those sanctified examples of communism who lived in bliss in the holy city of Moscow, where, Doremus judged, the streets were paved with undepreciable rubles. The holy city of Moscow. Carl looked upon it with exactly such uncritical and slightly hysterical adoration as other sectarians had in their day devoted to Jerusalem, Mecca, Rome, Canterbury, and Benares. Fine, all right, thought Doremus. Let 'em worship their sacred fonts. It was as good a game as any for the mentally retarded. Only why, then, should they object to his considering as sacred Fort Beulah or New York or Oklahoma City? Karl once fell into a froth because Doremus wondered if the iron deposits in Russia were all they might be. Why, certainly, Russia, being Holy Russia, must, as useful part of its holiness, have sufficient iron, and Karl needed no mineralogist reports, but only the blissful eye of faith to know it. He did not mind Karl's worshipping Holy Russia, but Karl did, using the word naive, which is the favorite word and just possibly the only word known to communist journalists, derisively mind when Doremus had a mild notion of worshipping Holy America. Karl spoke often of photographs in the Moscow News of nearly naked girls on Russian bathing beaches as proving the triumph and joy of the workers under Bolshevism, but he regarded precisely the same sort of photographs of nearly naked girls on Long Island bathing beaches as proving the degeneration of the workers under capitalism. As a newspaperman, Doremus remembered that the only reporters who misrepresented and concealed facts more unscrupulously than the capitalists were the communists. He was afraid that the world struggle today was not of communism against fascism, but of tolerance against the bigotry that was preached equally by communism and fascism. But he saw, too, that in America the struggle was befogged by the fact that the world's fascists were they who disowned the word fascism and preached enslavement to capitalism under the style of constitutional and traditional Native American liberty. For they were thieves not only of wages but of honor. To their purpose they could quote not only Scripture but Jefferson. That Karl Pascal should be turning into a zealot, like most of his chiefs in the Communist Party, was grievous to Doremus, because he had once simple-heartedly hoped that in the mass strength of communism there might be an escape from cynical dictatorship, but he saw now that he must remain alone, a liberal, scorned by all the noisier prophets for refusing to be a willing cat for the busy monkeys of either side. But at worst, the liberals, the tolerant, might, in the long run, preserve some sort of the arts of civilization, no matter which brand of tyranny should finally dominate the world. More and more, as I think about history, he pondered, I'm convinced that everything that is worthwhile in the world has been accomplished by the free, inquiring, critical spirit, and that the preservation of this spirit is more important than any social system whatsoever. But the men of ritual and the men of barbarism are capable of shutting up the men of science and of silencing them forever. Yes, this was the worst thing the enemies of honor, the pirate industrialists, and then their suitable successors, the corpos, with their blackjacks, had done. It had turned the brave, the generous, the passionate, and half-literate Karl Pascals into dangerous fanatics. And how well they had done it. Doremus was uncomfortable with Karl. He felt that his next term in jail might be under the wardenship of none other than Karl himself, as he remembered how the Bolsheviks, once in power, had most smugly imprisoned and persecuted those great women, Spiridonova and Breshkovskaya and Ismailovich, who by their conspiracies against the Tsar, their willingness to endure Siberian torture on behalf of freedom of the masses, had most brought on the revolution by which the Bolsheviks were able to take control and not only again forbid freedom to the masses, but this time informed them that anyway freedom was just a damn silly bourgeois superstition. So Doremus, sleeping 2.5 feet above his old companion, felt himself in a cell within a cell. Henry Veeder and Clarence Little and Victor Loveland and Mr. Falk were gone now, and to Julian, penned in solitary, he could not speak once a month. He yearned for escape with a desire that was near to insanity. Awake and asleep, it was his obsession, and he thought his heart had stopped when squad leader Aristide muttered to him as Doremus was scrubbing a lavatory floor, "Say, listen, Mr. Jessup, Miss Pike is fixing it up, and I'm going to help you escape just soon as things is right." It was a question of the guards on sentry go outside the quadrangle. As sweeper, Dreamus was reasonably free to leave his cell, and Eris had loosened the boards and barbed wire at the end of one of the alleys leading from the quadrangle between buildings. But outside he was likely to be shot by a guard on sight. For a week Eris watched. He knew that one of the night guards had a habit of getting drunk, which was forgiven him because of his excellence in flogging troublemakers, but which was regarded by the more judicious as rather regrettable. And for that week Eris fed the guard's habit on Lorinda's expense money, and was indeed so devoted to his duties that he was himself twice carried to bed. Snake Tisra grew interested, but Snake also, after the first couple of drinks, liked to be democratic and with his men, and to sing the old spinning wheel. Eris confided to Doremus, "Miss Pike, she don't dast send you a note lest somebody get a hold of it. But she says to me to tell you not to tell anybody you're going to take a sneak, or it'll get out." So on the evening when Eris jerked ahead at him from the corridor, then rasped, surly seeming, "Here you, Jessup! You left one of the cans all dirty." Doremus looked mildly at the cell that had been his home and study and tabernacle for 6 months, glanced at Carl Pascal reading in his bunk, slowly waving a shoeless foot in a sock with the end of it gone, at Truman Webb darning the seat of his pants, noted the gray smoke and filming tilting layers about the small electric bulb in the ceiling, and silently stepped out into the corridor. The late January night was foggy. Harris handed him a worn overcoat, whispered, "Third alley on the right. Moving van on corner opposite the church," and was gone. On hands and knees, Doremus briskly crawled under the loosened barbed wire at the end of the small alley and carelessly stepped out along the road. The only guard in sight was at a distance, and he was wavering in his gait. A block away, a furniture van was jacked up, while the driver and his helper painfully prepared to change one of the tremendous tires. In the light of the corner arc, Doremus saw that the driver was the same hard-faced, long-distance cruiser who had carried bundles of tracks for the new underground. The driver grunted, "Get in! Hustle!" Doremus crouched between a bureau and a wing chair inside. Instantly, he felt the tilted body of the van dropping as the driver pulled out the jack, and from the seat he heard, "All right, we're off. Crawl up behind me here and listen, Mr. Jessup. Can you hear me? The MMs don't take so much trouble to prevent you gents and respectable fellows from escaping. They figure that most of you are too scary to try out anything once you're away from your offices and front porches and sedans, but I guess you may be different some ways, Mr. Jessup. Besides, they figure that if you do escape, they can pick you up easily afterwards because you ain't on to hiding out like a regular fellow that's been out of work sometimes and maybe gone on the bum. But don't worry, we'll get you through. I tell you, there's nobody got friends like a revolutionist, and enemies." Then first did it come to Doremus that, by sentence of the late lamented Effingham Swan, he was subject to the death penalty for escaping, but, "Oh, what the hell," he grunted like Carl Pascal, and he stretched in the luxury of mobility in that galloping furniture truck. He was free. He saw the lights of villages going by. Once he was hidden beneath hay in a barn, again in a spruce grove high on a hill, and once he slept overnight on top of a coffin in the establishment of an undertaker. He walked secret paths. He rode in the back of an itinerant medicine peddler's car, and concealed in fur cap and high-collared fur coat in the sidecar of an underground worker serving as an squad leader. From this he dismounted at the driver's command in front of an obviously untenanted farmhouse on a snaky back road between Monadnock Mountain and the Averil Lakes, a very slattern of an old unpainted farmhouse with sinking roof and snow up to the frowsy windows. It seemed a mistake. Dreamus knocked as the motorcycle snarled away, and the door opened on Lorinda Pike and Sissy crying together, "Oh, my dear!" He could only mutter, "Wow!" When they had made him strip off his fur coat in the farmhouse living room, a room with peeling wallpaper and altogether bare except for a cot, 2 chairs, a table, the 2 moaning women saw a small man, his face dirty, pasty, and sunken as by tuberculosis, his once fussily trimmed beard and mustache ragged as the wisps of hay, his overlong hair a rustic jag at the back, his clothes ripped and filthy, an old, sick, discouraged tramp. He dropped on a straight chair and stared at them. Maybe they were genuine. Maybe they really were there. Maybe he was, as it seemed, in heaven looking at the 2 principal angels. But he had been so often fooled so cruelly in his visions these dreary months. He sobbed, and they comforted him with softly stroking hands and not too confoundedly much babble. "I've got a hot bath for you, and I'll scrub your back, and then some hot chicken soup and ice cream." As though one should say, "The Lord God awaits you on his throne, and all whom you bless shall be blessed, and all your enemies brought to their knees." Those sainted women had actually had a long tin tub fetched to the kitchen of the old house, filled it with water heated in kettle and dishpan on the stove, and provided brushes, soap, a vast sponge, and such a long, caressing bath towel as Dreamus had forgotten existed. And somehow, from Fort Beulah, Sissy had brought plenty of his own shoes and shirts and 3 suits that now seemed to him fit for royalty. He, who had not had a hot bath for 6 months, and for 3 had worn the same underclothes, and for 2, in clammy winter, no socks whatever. If the presence of Lorinda and Sissy was token of heaven, to slide inch by slow, ecstatic inch into the tub was its proof, and he lay soaking in glory. When he was half dressed, the 2 came in, and there was about as much thought of modesty or need for it as though he were the 2-year-old babe he somewhat resembled. They were laughing at him, but laughter became sharp whimpers of horror when they saw the gridiron meat of his back, but nothing more demanding than, "Oh, my dear," did Lorinda say even then. Though Sissy had once been glad that Lorinda spared her any mothering, Dreamus rejoiced in it. Snake, Tisra, and the Trianon concentration camp had been singularly devoid of any mothering. Lorinda salved his back and powdered it. She cut his hair, not too unskillfully. She cooked for him all the heavy, earthy dishes of which he had dreamed, hungry in a cell: Hamburg steak with onions, corn pudding, buckwheat cakes with sausages, apple dumplings with hard and soft sauce, and cream of mushroom soup. It had not been safe to take him to the comforts of her tea room at Beecher Falls. Already MMs had been there, snooping after him. But Sissy and she had, for such refugees as they might be forwarding for the new underground, provided this dingy farmhouse with 6 cots and rich stores of canned goods in beautiful bottles. Dreamus considered them of honey and marmalade and Bar-le-Duc. The actual final crossing of the border into Canada was easier than it had been when Buck Titus had tried to smuggle the Jessup family over. It had become a system, as in the piratical days, of bootlegging, with new forest paths, bribery of frontier guards, and forged passports. He was safe, yet just to make safety safer, Lorinda and Sissy, rubbing their chins, they looked Dreamus over, still discussing him as brazenly as though he were a baby who could not understand them, decided to turn him into a young man. "Dye his hair and mustache black and shave the beard, I think. I wish we had time to give him a nice Florida tan with an alpine lamp, too," considered Lorinda. "Yes, I think you will look sweet that way," said Sissy. "I will not have my beard off," he protested. "How do I know what kind of chin I'll have when it's naked?" Why, the man still thinks he's a newspaper proprietor and One of Fort Beulah's social favorites, marveled Sissy, as they ruthlessly set to work. Only real reason for these damn wars and revolutions anyway is the women folks get a chance. Ouch! Be careful. To be dear little amateur mothers to every male they can get there in their clutches. Hair dye, said Doremus bitterly. But he was shamelessly proud of his youthful face when it was denuded, and he discovered that he had a quite tolerably stubborn chin, and Sissy was sent back to Beecher Falls to keep the tea room alive. And for 3 days, Lorinda and he gobbled steaks and ale and played pinochle and lay talking infinitely of all they had thought about each other in the 6 desert months that might have been 60 years. He was to remember the sloping farmhouse bedroom and a shred of rag carpet and a couple of rickety chairs, and Lorinda snuggled under the old red comforter on the cot, not as winter poverty, but as youth and adventurous love. Then, in a forest clearing, with snow along the spruce boughs, a few feet across into Canada, he was peering into the eyes of his 2 women, curtly saying goodbye and trudging off into the new prison of exile, from the America to which already he was looking back with the long pain of nostalgia. End of chapter 36. It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, chapter 37. His beard had grown again. He and his beard had been friends for many years, and he had missed it of late. His hair and mustache had again assumed a respectable gray, in place of the purple dye that under electric lights had looked so bogus. He was no longer impassioned at the sight of a lamb chop or a cake of soap, but he had not yet got over the pleasure and slight amazement at being able to talk freely as he would, as emphatically as might please him, and in public. He sat with his 2 closest friends in Montreal, 2 fellow executives in the Department of Propaganda and Publications of the New Underground, Walt Trowbridge, general chairman, and these 2 friends were the Honorable Pearlie Beecroft, who presumably was the President of the United States, and Joe Elfrey, an ornamental young man who, as Mr. Cayley, had been a prize agent of the Communist Party in America till he had been kicked out of that almost imperceptible body for having made a united front with socialists, Democrats, and even choir singers when organizing an anti-corporal revolt in Texas. Over their ale in this cafe, Beecroft and Elfrey were at it as usual, Elfrey insisting that the only solution of American distress was dictatorship by the livelier representatives of the toiling masses, strict and if need be violent, but this was his new heresy, not governed by Moscow. Beecroft was gaseously asserting that all we needed was a return to precisely the political parties, the drumming up of votes, and the oratorical legislating by Congress of the contented days of William B. McKinley. But as for Doremus, he leaned back, not vastly caring what nonsense the others might talk, so long as it was permitted them to talk at all without finding that the waiters were spies, and content to know that whatever happened, Trowbridge and the other authentic leaders would never go back to satisfaction in government of profits, by the profits, and for the profits. He thought comfortably of the fact that just yesterday, he had this from the chairman's secretary, Walt Trowbridge had dismissed Wilson J. Shale, the ducal oil man who had come, apparently with sincerity, to offer his fortune and his executive experience to Trowbridge and the cause. Nope, sorry, Will, but we can't use you. Whatever happens, even if Hake marches over and slaughters all of us along with all your Canadian hosts, you and your kind of clever pirates are finished. Whatever happens, whatever details of a new system of government may be decided upon, whether we call it a cooperative commonwealth or state socialism or communism or revived traditional democracy, there's got to be a new feeling that government is not a game for a few smart, resolute athletes like you, Will, but a universal partnership in which the state must own all resources so large that they affect all members of the state, in which the one worst crime won't be murder or kidnapping, but taking advantage of the state, in which the seller of fraudulent medicine or the liar in Congress will be punished a whole lot worse than the fellow who takes an axe to the man who's grabbed off his girl, eh? What's going to happen to magnates like you, Will? God knows. What happened to the dinosaurs? So was Doremus in his service well content. Yet socially he was almost as lonely as in his cell at Trianon, almost as savagely he longed for the not exorbitant pleasure of being with Lorinda, Buck, Emma, Sissy, and Steve Perfeeks. None of them, saved Emma, could join him in Canada, and she would not. Her letters suggested fear of the unworcesterian wilderness of Montreal. She wrote that Philip and she hoped they might be able to get Doremus forgiven by the Corpos. So he was left to associate only with his fellow refugees from Corpoism, and he knew a life that had been familiar, far too familiar, to political exiles ever since the first revolt in Egypt sent the rebels sneaking off into Assyria. It was no particularly indecent egoism in Doremus that made him suppose when he arrived in Canada that everyone would thrill to his tale of imprisonment, torture, and escape, but he found that 10,000 spirited tellers of woe had come there before him, and that the Canadians, however attentive and generous hosts they might be, were actively sick of pumping up new sympathy. They felt that their quota of martyrs was completely filled, and as to the exiles who came in penniless, and that was the majority of them, the Canadians became distinctly weary of depriving their own families on behalf of unknown refugees, and they couldn't even keep up forever a gratification in the presence of celebrated American authors, politicians, scientists, when they came common as mosquitoes. It was doubtful if a lecture on the deplorable conditions in America by Herbert Hoover and General Pershing together would have attracted 40 people. Ex-governors and judges were glad to get jobs washing dishes, and ex-managing editors were hoeing turnips, and reports said that Mexico and London and France were growing alike apologetically bored. So Doremus, meagerly living on his $20 a week salary from the NU, met no one save his own fellow exiles, in just such saloons of unfortunate political escapists as the White Russians, the Red Spaniards, the Blue Bulgarians, and all the other polychromatic insurrectionists frequented in Paris. They crowded together, 20 of them, in a parlor 12 by 12, very like the concentration camp cells in area, inhabitants and eventual smell from 8 p.m. till midnight, and made up for lack of dinner with coffee and donuts and esquias sandwiches, and talked without cessation about the Corpos. They told as actual facts stories about President Hayek, which had formerly been applied to Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini, the one about the man who was alarmed to find he had saved Hayek from drowning and begged him not to tell. In the cafes, they seized the newspapers from home. Men who had had an eye gouged out on behalf of freedom, with the roomy remaining one peered to see who had won the Missouri Avenue Bridge Club prize. They were brave and romantic, tragic and distinguished, and Doremus became a little sick of them all, and of the final brutality of fact that no normal man can very long endure another's tragedy, and that friendly weeping will someday turn to irritated kicking. He was stirred when, in a hastily built American interdenominational chapel, he heard a starveling who had once been a pompous bishop read from the pine pulpit. "By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy." Here in Canada, the Americans had their weeping wall, and daily cried with false gallant hope, "Next year in Jerusalem." Sometimes Dreamus was vexed by the ceaseless demanding wails of refugees who had lost everything, sons and wives and property and self-respect, vexed that they had believed they alone had seen such horrors, and sometimes he spent all his spare hours raising $1 in a little weary friendliness for these sick souls, and sometimes he saw as fragments of paradise every aspect of America, such oddly assorted glimpses as Meade at Gettysburg, and the massed blue petunias in Emma's Lost Garden, and the fresh shine of rails as seen from a train on an April morning, and Rockefeller Center. But whatever his mood, he refused to sit down with his harp by any foreign waters whatever and enjoy the importance of being a celebrated beggar. He'd get back to America and chance another prison. Meantime, he neatly sent packages of literary dynamite out from the NU offices all day long and efficiently directed 100 envelope addressers who had once been professors and pastry cooks. He had asked his superior, Pearlie Beecroft, for assignment in more active and more dangerous work as a secret agent in America, out west, where he was not known, but headquarters had suffered a good deal from amateur agents who babbled to strangers who could not be trusted to keep their mouths shut while they were being flogged to death. Things had changed since 1929. The NU believed that the highest honor a man could earn was not to have $1 million, but to be permitted to risk his life for truth without pay or praise. Dreamus knew that his chiefs did not consider him young enough or strong enough, but also that they were studying him. Twice he had had honor of interviews with Trowbridge about nothing in particular. Surely it must have been an honor, though it was hard to remember it, because Trowbridge was the simplest and friendliest man in the whole pretentious spy machine. Cheerfully, Dreamus hoped for a chance to help make the poor, overworked, worried corpo officials even more miserable than they normally were now that war with Mexico and revolts against corporalism were jingling side by side. In July 1939, when Dreamus had been in Montreal a little over 5 months, and a year after a sentence to the concentration camp, the American newspapers which arrived at NU headquarters were full of resentment against Mexico. Bands of Mexicans had raided across into the United States, always, curiously enough, when our troops were off in the desert practicing marching or perhaps gathering seashells. They burned a town in Texas. Fortunately, all the women and children were away on a Sunday school picnic that afternoon. A Mexican patriot, aforetime he had also worked as an Ethiopian patriot, a Chinese patriot, and a Haitian patriot, came across to the tent of an brigadier and confessed that while it hurt him to tattle on his own beloved country, conscience compelled him to reveal that his Mexican superiors were planning to fly over and bomb Laredo, San Antonio, Bisbee, and probably Tacoma and Bangor, Maine. This excited the corpo newspapers very much indeed, and in New York and Chicago they published photographs of the conscientious traitor half an hour after he had appeared at the brigadier's tent, where at about that moment 46 reporters happened to be sitting about on neighboring cactuses. America rose to defend her hearthstones, including all the hearthstones on Park Avenue, New York, against the false and treacherous Mexico with its appalling army of 67,000 men with 39 military airplanes. Women in Cedar Rapids hid under the bed. Elderly gentlemen in Cattaraugus County, New York, concealed their money in elm tree bowls, and the wife of a chicken raiser 7 miles northeast of Esteline, South Dakota, a woman widely known as a good cook and trained observer, distinctly saw a file of 92 Mexican soldiers pass her cabin, starting at 3:17 a.m. on July 27, 1939. To answer this threat, America, the one country that had never lost a war and never started an unjust one, rose as one man, as the Chicago Daily Evening Corporate put it. It was planned to invade Mexico as soon as it could be cool enough, or even earlier if the refrigeration and air conditioning could be arranged. In 1 month, 5 million men were drafted for the invasion and started training. Thus, perhaps too flippantly, did Joe Cayley and Doremus discuss the declaration of war against Mexico. If they found the whole crusade absurd, it may be stated in their defense that they regarded all wars always as absurd. In the baldness of the lying by both sides about the causes, in the spectacle of grown-up men engaged in the infinite diversions of dressing up in fancy clothes and marching to primitive music. The only thing not absurd about war, said Doremus and Cayley, was that, along with their skittishness, they did kill a good many millions of people. 10,000 starving babies seemed too high a price for a Sam Brown belt for even the sweetest, touchingest young lieutenant. Yet both Doremus and Cayley swiftly recanted their assertion that all wars were absurd and abominable. Both of them made exception of the People's War against tyranny, as suddenly America's agreeable anticipation of stealing Mexico was checked by a popular rebellion against the whole corpo regime. The revolting section was, roughly, bounded by Sault Ste. Marie, Detroit, Cincinnati, Wichita, San Francisco, and Seattle, though in that territory large patches remained loyal to President Hake, and outside of it other large patches joined the rebels. It was the part of America which had always been the most radical, that indefinite word which probably means most critical of piracy. It was the land of the Populists, the non-partisan league, the Farmer Labor Party, and the La Folliers, a family so vast as to form a considerable party in itself. Whatever might happen, exulted Doremus, the revolt proved that belief in America and hope for America were not dead. These rebels had, most of them, before his election, believed in Buzz Windrip's 15 points, believed that when he said he wanted to return the power pilfered by the bankers and industrialists to the people, he more or less meant that he wanted to return the power of the bankers and industrialists to the people. As month by month they saw that they had been cheated with marked cards again, they were indignant, but they were busy with cornfield and sawmill and dairy and motor factory, and it took the impertinent idiocy of demanding that they march down into a desert and help steal a friendly country to jab them into awakening and into discovering that, while they had been asleep, they had been kidnapped by a small gang of criminals armed with high ideals, well-buttered words, and a lot of machine guns. So profound was the revolt that the Catholic Archbishop of California and the radical ex-governor of Minnesota found themselves in the same faction. At first it was a rather comic outbreak, comic as the ill-trained, uninformed, confusedly thinking revolutionists of Massachusetts in 1776 President General Hake publicly jeered at them as a ridiculous ragtag rebellion of hobos too lazy to work, and at first they were unable to do anything more than scold like a flock of crows, throw bricks at detachments of MMs and policemen, wreck troop trains, and destroy the property of such honest private citizens as owned corpo newspapers. It was in August that the shock came, when General Emmanuel Kuhn, Chief of Staff of the Regulars, flew from Washington to St. Paul, took command of Fort Snelling, and declared for Walt Trowbridge as temporary President of the United States, to hold office until there should be a new, universal, and uncontrolled presidential election. Trowbridge proclaimed acceptance with the proviso that he should not be a candidate for permanent president. By no means all of the regulars joined Kuhn's revolutionary troops. There are two sturdy myths among the liberals: that the Catholic Church is less puritanical and always more ascetic than the Protestant, and that professional soldiers hate war more than do congressmen and old maids. But there were enough regulars who were fed up with the exactions of a greedy, mouth-dripping corpo commissioners, and who threw in with General Kuhn, so that immediately after, his army of regulars and hastily trained Minnesota farmers had won the Battle of Mankato. The forces at Leavenworth took control of Kansas City and planned to march on St. Louis and Omaha, while in New York, Governor's Island and Fort Wadsworth looked on, neutral, as unmilitarily looking and mostly Jewish guerrillas seized the subways, power stations, and railway terminals. But there the revolt halted, because in the America which had so warmly praised itself for its widespread popular free education, there had been so very little education, widespread, popular, free, or anything else, that most people did not know what they wanted, indeed knew about so few things to want at all. There had been plenty of schoolrooms, there had been lacking only literate teachers and eager pupils, and school boards who regarded teaching as a profession worthy of as much honor and pay as insurance selling or embalming or waiting on table. Most Americans had learned in school that God had supplanted the Jews as the chosen people by the Americans, and this time done the job much better, so that we were the richest, kindest, and cleverest nation living, that depressions were but passing headaches, and that labor unions must not concern themselves with anything except higher wages and shorter hours, and above all must not set up an ugly class struggle by combining politically. That, though foreigners tried to make a bogus mystery of them, politics were really so simple that any village attorney or any clerk in the office of a metropolitan sheriff was quite adequately trained for them. And if John D. Rockefeller or Henry Ford had set his mind to it, he could have become the most distinguished statesman, composer, physicist, or poet in the land. Even 2.5 years of despotism had not yet taught most electors humility, nor taught them much of anything except that it was unpleasant to be arrested too often. So, after the first gay eruption of rioting, the revolt slowed up. Neither the corpos nor many of their opponents knew enough to formulate a clear, sure theory of self-government or irresistibly resolved to engage in the sore labor of fitting themselves for freedom. Even yet, after Winthrop, most of the easygoing descendants of the wisecracking Benjamin Franklin had not learned that Patrick Henry's "give me liberty or give me death" meant anything more than a high school yell or a cigarette slogan. The followers of Trowbridge and General Coon, the American Cooperative Commonwealth they began to call themselves, did not lose any of the territory they had seized. They held it, driving out all corpo agents, now and then added a county or two. But mostly their rule, and equally the corpo's rule, was as unstable as politics in Ireland. So the task of Walt Trowbridge, which in August had seemed finished, before October seemed merely to have begun. Doremus Jessup was called into Trowbridge's office to hear from the chairman. "I guess the time's come when we need an underground agents in the States with sense as well as guts. Report to General Barnes for service proselytizing in Minnesota. Good luck, Brother Jessup. Try to persuade the orators that are still holding out for discipline and clubs that they ain't so much stalwart as funny." And all that Doremus thought was, "Kind of nice fellow, Trowbridge. Glad to be working with him," as he set off on his new task of being a spy and professional hero without even any funny passwords to make the game romantic. End chapter 37. It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, chapter 38. His packing was done. It had been very simple, since his kit consisted only of toilet things, one change of clothes, and the first volume of Spengler's Decline of the West. He was waiting in his hotel lobby for time to take the train to Winnipeg. He was interested by the entrance of a lady more decorative than the females customarily seen in this modest inn, a hand-tooled presentation copy of a lady in crushed levant and satin doublure, a lady with mascaraed eyelashes, a permanent wave, and a cobweb frock. She ambled through the lobby and leaned against a fake marble pillar, wielding a long cigarette holder and staring at Doremus. She seemed amused by him for no clear reason. Could she be some sort of a corpo spy? She lounged toward him, and he realized that she was Lorinda Pike. While he was still gasping, she chuckled. "Oh, no, darling, I'm not so realistic in my art as to carry out this role too far. It just happens to be the easiest disguise to win over Corpo Frontier Guards. If you'll agree, it really is a disguise. He kissed her with a fury which shocked the respectable hostelry. She knew from NU agents that he was going out into a very fair risk of being flogged to death. She had come solely to say farewell and bring him what might be his last budget of news. Buck was in a concentration camp. He was more feared and more guarded than Doremus had been, and Lorinda had not been able to buy him out. Julian, Carl, and John Polycop were still alive, still in prison. Father Parafix was running the NU cell in Fort Beulah, but slightly confused because he wanted to approve of the war with Mexico, a nation which he detested for its treatment of Catholic priests. Lorinda and he had, apparently, fought bloodily all one evening about Catholic rule in Latin America. As is always typical of liberals, Lorinda managed to speak of Father Parafix at once with virtuous loathing and the greatest affection. Emma and David were reported as well content in Worcestershire, although there were murmurs that Philip's wife did not too thankfully receive her mother-in-law's advice on cooking. Sissy was becoming a deaf agitator who, still remembering that she was a born architect, drew plans for houses that Julian and she would someday adorn. She contrived blissfully to combine assaults on all capitalism with an entirely capitalistic conception of the year-long honeymoons Julian and she were going to have. Less surprising than any of this were the tidings that Frances Tasbro, very beautiful in repentance, had been let out of the Corpo prison to which he had been sent for too much grafting and was again a district commissioner, well thought of, and that his housekeeper was now Mrs. Candy, whose daily reports on his most secret arrangements were most neatly written and sternly grammatical documents that came into the Vermont NU headquarters. Then Lorinda was looking up at him as he stood in the vestibule of the westbound train and crying, "You look so well again. Are you happy? Oh, be happy." Even now he did not see this defeminized radical woman crying. She turned away from him and raced down the station platform too quickly. She had lost all her confident pose of flip elegance. Leaning out from the vestibule, he saw her stop at the gate, diffidently raise her hand as if to wave at the long anonymity of the train windows, then shakily march away through the gates. And he realized that she hadn't even his address, that no one who loved him would have any stable address for him now anymore. Mr. William Barton Dobbs, a traveling man for harvesting machinery, an erect little man with a small gray beard and a Vermont accent, got out of bed in his hotel in a section in Minnesota which had so many Bavarian, American, and Yankee-descended farmers and so few radical Scandinavians that it was still loyal to President Haig. He went down to breakfast cheerfully rubbing his hands. He consumed grapefruit and porridge, but without sugar. There was an embargo on sugar. He looked down and inspected himself. He sighed. "I'm getting too much of a pod with all this outdoor work and being so hungry. I've got to cut down on the grub," and he consumed fried eggs, bacon, toast, coffee made of acorns, and marmalade made of carrots. Kuhn's troops had shut off coffee beans and oranges. He read, meantime, the Minneapolis Daily Corporate. It announced a great victory in Mexico, in the same place, he noted, in which there had already been 3 great victories in the past 2 weeks. Also, a shameful rebellion had been put down in Andalusia, Alabama. It was reported that General Goring was coming over to be the guest of President Haig, and the pretender Trowbridge was said by a reliable source to have been assassinated, kidnapped, and compelled to resign. "No news this morning," regretted Mr. William Barton Dobbs. As he came out of the hotel, a squad of Minutemen were marching by. They were farm boys, newly recruited for service in Mexico. They looked as scared and soft and big-footed as a rout of rabbits. They tried to pipe up the newest, oldest war song in the manner of the Civil War ditty when Johnny comes marching home again. When Johnny comes home from Greece or land, hurrah, hurrah. His ears will be full of desert sand, hurrah, hurrah. But he'll speak a dispiggity pretty sweet, and he'll bring us a gun and senorite, and we'll all get stewed when Johnny comes marching home. Their voices wavered. They peeped at the crowd along the walk, or looked sulkily down at their dragging feet, and the crowd, which once would have been yelping, "Hail Hake!" was snickering. "You beggars will never get up to Greaserland." And even from the safety of a second-story window, "Hurrah, hurrah for Trowbridge!" Poor devils, thought Mr. William Barton Dobbs, as he watched the frightened toy soldiers, not too toy-like to keep them from dying. Yet it is a fact that he could see in the crowd numerous persons whom his arguments, and those of the 60-odd NU secret agents under him, had converted from fear of the MMs to jeering. In his open Ford convertible, he never started it, but he thought of how he had put it over on Sissy by getting a Ford all his own. Dreamus drove out of the village into stubble-lined prairie. The meadowlark's liquid ecstasy welcomed him from the barbed wire fences. If he missed the strong hills behind Fort Beulah, he was yet exalted by the immensity of the sky, the openness of prairie that promised he could go on forever, the gaiety of small sloughs seen through their fringes of willows and cottonwoods, and once aspiring overhead, an early flight of mallards. He whistled boisterously as he bounced along the section-line road. He reached a gaunt yellow farmhouse. It was to have had a porch, but there was only an unpainted nothingness low down on the front wall to show where the porch would be. To a farmer who was oiling a tractor in the big littered farmyard, he chirped, "Name's William Barton Dobbs, representing the Des Moines Combine and Up-to-Date Implement Company." The farmer galloped up to shake hands, breathing. "By golly, this is a great honor, Mr. Dobbs. That's right. Excuse me." In an upper bedroom of the farmhouse, 7 men were waiting, perched on a chair and table and edges of the bed, or just squatted on the floor. Some of them were apparently farmers, some ambitious shopkeepers. As Dreamus bustled in, they rose and bowed. "Good morning, gentlemen. A little news," he said. "Coon has driven the corpos out of Yankton and Sioux Falls. Now I wonder if you're ready with your reports." To the agent whose difficulty in converting farm owners had been their dread of paying decent wages to farmhands, Dreamus presented for use the argument as formalized yet passionate as the observations of a life insurance agent upon the death by motor accident, that poverty for one was poverty for all. It wasn't such a very new argument, nor so very logical, but it had been useful carrot for many human mules. For the agent among the Finnish-American settlers who were insisting that Trowbridge was a Bolshevik and just as bad as the Russians, Dreamus had a mimeographed quotation from the Avestia of Moscow damning Trowbridge as a social fascist quack. For the Bavarian farmers down the other way, who were still vaguely pro-Nazi, Dreamus had a German émigré paper published in Prague proving, though without statistics or any considerable quotation from official documents, that by agreement with Hitler, President Hake was, if he remained in power, going to ship back to the German army all German Americans with so much as one grandparent born in the fatherland. "Do we close with a cheerful hymn and the benediction, Mr. Dobbs?" demanded the youngest and most flippant and quite most successful agent. "I wouldn't mind. Maybe it wouldn't be so unsuitable as you think, but considering the loose morals and economics of most of you comrades, perhaps it would be better if I closed with a new story about Hake and Mae West that I heard day before yesterday. Bless y'all. Goodbye." As he drove to his next meeting, Dreamus fretted, "I don't believe that Prague story about Hake and Hitler is true. I think I'll quit using it. Oh, I know, Mr. Dobbs, as you say. If you did tell the truth to a Nazi, it would still be a lie, but just the same, I think I'll quit using it. Lorinda and me, that thought we could get free of Puritanism. Those cumulus clouds are better than a galleon. If they'd just move Mount Terror and Fort Beulah and Lorinda and Buck here, this would be paradise. Oh Lord, I don't want to, but I suppose I'll have to order the attack on the MM post at Osakis now. They're ready for it. I wonder if that shotgun charge was intended for me. Didn't really like Lorinda's hair fixed up in that New York style at all. He slept that night in a cottage on the shore of a sandy-bottomed lake ringed with bright birches. His host and his host's wife, worshippers of Trowbridge, had insisted on giving him their own room, with the patchwork quilt and the hand-painted pitcher and bowl. He dreamed, as he still did dream once or twice a week, that he was back in his cell at Trianon. He knew again the stink, the cramped and warty bunk, the never-relaxed fear that he might be dragged out and flogged. He heard magic trumpets. A soldier opened the door and invited out all the prisoners. There, in the quadrangle, General Emmanuel Kuhn, who, to Doremus's dreaming fancy, looked exactly like Sherman, addressed them. "Gentlemen, the Commonwealth Army has conquered. Hague has been captured. You are free." So they marched out, the prisoners, the bent and scarred and crippled, the vacant-eyed and slobbering, who had come into this place as erect and daring men. Doremus, Dan Wilgus, Buck, Julian, Mr. Falk, Henry Veeder, Carl Pascal, John Polycop, Truman Webb. They crept out of the quadrangle gates, through a double line of soldiers standing rigidly at present arms, yet weeping as they watched the broken prisoners crawling past. And beyond the soldiers, Doremus saw the women and children. They were waiting for him, the kind arms of Lorinda and Emma and Sissy and Mary, with David behind them, clinging to his father's hand and Father Parafix. And Foolish was there, his tail a proud plume. And from the dream-blurred crowd came Mrs. Candy, holding out to him a coconut cake. Then all of them were fleeing, frightened by Shad Ledoux. His host was slapping Doremus's shoulder, muttering, "Just had a phone call. Corporal Posse out after you." So Doremus rode out, saluted by the meadowlarks, and onward all day to a hidden cabin in the northern woods, where quiet men awaited news of freedom. And still Doremus goes on in the red sunrise, for a Doremus Jessup can never die. End of chapter 38, and end of It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis.